Welcome, Victoria. I'm so pleased to be with you today. And everyone, we're with Victoria Tauli-Corpuz, Indigenous rights activist and a student of Indigenous peoples and herself a member of the Kakanae Igorot peoples in Luzon, Philippines, and the third special UN rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. It's such a pleasure to be with you today, Vicky, and to hear your observation. If I might draw you out from your position, the rights of Indigenous peoples today, and how you see Indigenous people on the broad horizon.
Okay. Thank you very much, John, and thank you for having this interview with me. Well, with regards Indigenous peoples' realities in the world today, sorry, excuse me, we still face, Indigenous people still face a lot of challenges in terms of how their rights are being respected, protected, and fulfilled by governments. Uh, but the good news is that there is now an international standard that sets the norms for the rights of Indigenous peoples, which is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted in 2007 by the UN General Assembly. And this has helped a lot in terms of making more visible the realities that Indigenous peoples face, as well as it has given Indigenous peoples a tool that they can use to get their governments to respect and protect their rights. No, so that's the good part. The the bad part, though, is that many of the Indigenous peoples in various parts of the world are still suffering from the violation of their rights, like their displacement from their lands, territory, and territories. There are still many cases of forced evictions, as well as uh, big corporations entering into Indigenous territories or government projects being brought into their territories without obtaining the free prior informed consent of the Indigenous peoples who are in those territories. No, and of course the right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination, which means either they are autonomously governing themselves. No, this exists. This continues to exist in many parts of the world, but with the national laws and policies which discriminate and marginalize Indigenous peoples, there is an erosion in these Indigenous governance systems, which has served Indigenous peoples for a long time. Uh, but in spite of all this, Indigenous peoples are still strengthening their own movements, their own actions to protest against those kinds of development brought into their territories without their consent, as well as to assert that they have their own existing knowledge systems or philosophies or cosmologies, that they have learned from their ancestors and that they continue to live by. So many Indigenous peoples are consciously asserting that these kinds of systems, whether these governance systems or justice systems that have been used by them even before colonization, and that still exists up to the present, should continue to remain and be recognized by the government and be included in the nation building work that the state is doing. No, uh, I I always say that Indigenous peoples actually do contribute to nation state building because they are providing the diversity, that a nation needs to have for it to become multicultural and a multinational. These kinds of systems that continue to exist up to now are actually showing now that the last remaining frontiers of better kept uh, ecosystems are in Indigenous territories. And the reason why that is so is because they continue to assert that their systems of relating with nature, of sustaining the environment, are tried and tested, and they would like to continue such practices. So that's the good news. At least, many indigenous peoples have been persistent in influencing and informing governments and the dominant societies that their systems are not backward, or pagan or superstitious. These are very vibrant systems that in fact has contributed in making this world much better, no, in terms of environmental sustainability and in terms of cultural diversity. Well, yes, yeah, my first experience in the UN has been in my participation in the drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and this was really the first step that Indigenous peoples have taken to go into the UN, to a global system, to complain about what is happening to them, and at the same time demand that the international community should look into this and develop policies or norms that will protect indigenous peoples, that will protect their rights. So that is how those were the beginnings of indigenous peoples coming together, sharing the situation that they face, and helping draft that UN declaration for more than 20 years. Actually, we started in 1985, doing the drafting, negotiating each and every article of the declaration, and with the support of both the UN. The UN has a voluntary fund that brings indigenous peoples to the UN, and there are donors who also brought indigenous peoples there. We managed to connect with each other, and in the process, we shared our own visions of what we would like our futures to be, and what role the international community can play. So that is how we all started, and then we fought for more spaces within the United Nations. The first one was the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which we wanted to be based in New York, because most of the work on indigenous peoples are based in Geneva, and yet it's in New York where you talk about development, about environment. So we thought we should occupy a space in the UN there, so that we will be able to influence policies, as well as bring to the attention of the international community the situations that we are facing. Then we also very strongly for the establishment of the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, and this was established in 2001. And finally, we worked for the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, which is based in Geneva. It's a body under the Human Rights Council, and this sort of took over the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations, which was the group that drafted and adopted the declaration. So for instance, last year, finally the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has established a platform for sharing of local communities and indigenous peoples on their actions on climate change adaptation and mitigation, no? And of course, the Convention on Biodiversity also has an article that recognizes the importance of indigenous people's knowledge. At in the last event, that process that we influenced was the Green Climate Fund. This is the fund that supports countries when they undertake climate change actions. We managed to have them adopt an indigenous people's policy that basically says that when you are funding climate change actions, whether this is for mitigation or adaptation, you have to ensure that the rights of indigenous peoples are being respected and protected.
Excellent, excellent. That's such a fine overview, Vicky. Now, recently, in the last few years, the concept of integral ecology has come forward. I'm thinking, for example, of the 2015 encyclical of Pope Francis, Laudato Si, in which he very consciously joins social justice with ecological or environmental justice. And I think that's such an important concept, which I also hear in your own work,
Mhm.
understanding how people in place are
Mhm.
connected with biodiversity. Can you
Mhm.
say a bit about how integral ecology is now coming into fuller understanding in relationship to indigenous societies?
Yes, thank you. Yes, in fact, I have been very encouraged by the Laudato Si of the Pope, of Pope Francis, and I myself had gone to Rome. I was invited in the Amazon Synod that they had, where this whole concept of integral ecology has been discussed, no? And I think this integral ecology does capture the way that indigenous peoples regard their relationship with nature, with their neighbors, and of course with the world in general, no? That you cannot separate environment from development. You cannot separate environment and development from respecting the rights of people in our case, of course, indigenous people's rights, as well as the cosmologies, no,
Yeah.
of various peoples. To a certain degree, I think that this integral ecology does recognize that there are diverse ways of thinking, diverse faiths, but they all believe that nature has to be part of conserving, protecting nature, and sustaining nature has to be part of our daily lives, no, and in our has to form uh, has to be at the core of how we relate, with of course with all the uh, living and non-living things around the world, but also with our neighbors, whatever colors, whatever cultures they have.
And Vicky, I wanted to follow up with an observation that integral ecology has provided ways for non-native peoples to come into
Mhm,
a clearer
mhm,
understanding of that connection between cultural wisdom and environmental
mhm.
concern. And from indigenous people's standpoint, I'm beginning to see much more attention to cosmovision and
Exactly.
cosmopolitics now. And it strikes me that that
Mhm.
provides a way for indigenous people to speak from out of their own wisdom and to find their own
Exactly.
language. Is that your experience also?
Yes, absolutely. Um, in fact, a few days ago, I had meetings here in the Philippines with the interfaith bodies, where I talked about this as well. And many of the various religions, not just in the Philippines but in Asia, have absolutely spoken, more clearly about indigenous peoples and how this links, with how our cosmologies link directly with what the people of different faiths believe in as well, no. And so I think that affirmation that integral ecology is indeed one of the ways that we can solve the problems that we face now, uh, gives indigenous peoples a higher profile, no.
Yeah.
The world is in a very bad situation nowadays with the COVID pandemic, no, and the increasing adverse impacts of climate change. And I think that to a certain degree, people are also getting desperate, no, and seeking very, you know, uh, actively for solutions to these problems. And that's where indigenous peoples' cosmologies come in, uh, not only because of what we say, but also because many scientific researchers now are showing the overlaps between indigenous territories and highest levels of biological diversity, no, as well as ecosystems, whether forest or marine ecosystems, are in a much better shape than even those protected areas that the governments have developed. No, there are now many maps that will show that in national protected areas which are being managed by the governments, the situation is not so good compared to indigenous peoples' protected areas, those areas that they themselves have protected and conserved. No, so I think that these kinds of scientific evidences are also enhancing, no, the kind of the contributions that indigenous peoples can provide, you know, even amidst these forest fires. Remember, you have your own forest fires in the US, the
Yes.
bushfires, for instance, in Australia, among others. Many indigenous peoples have always said that, you know, when we do manage fires very well, we know how to sustain our territory so that the fires will not come into the ecosystems that we are protecting. And I've seen this. I myself went to Santa Clara County and in New Mexico, and I saw that there was this forest fire that destroyed their forest, and it was because the federally kept forest was burning. And for many years, the indigenous peoples in Santa Clara protected that forest, but because the federal system doesn't recognize or support their systems, it went through the territories of the indigenous peoples.
Can I also ask you, with regard to rights of nature, which has
Mhm.
become a more prominent issue now, where
Mm.
nation states are in many instances following the lead of indigenous people in understanding how to protect rivers and mountains
Mhm.
and forest groves by
Mm.
recognizing their capacity to have legal standing. And I think
Mm.
this is another major contribution of indigenous thought. Can
Mm.
you comment then on this issue of rights of nature and earth jurisprudence?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, well, you know, as we say, our cosmologies are basically based on natural law, you know, and so we do believe that nature by in itself has to be protected, and they have rights to continue it to exist in the most in the best forms that they can, you know. And we do support, you know, this kind of framework. We just want uh, to have a little a caveat that we that to present that, you know, when we talk about the rights of nature, we also need to talk about who is going to protect those rights, no?
Yes.
uh, because of course, I mean, indigenous peoples have always been protecting these rights of nature, but suddenly with the states coming into the picture, then they will assume the posture of being the ones protecting the rights of nature again, no, so it will somehow take over the system that exists in the past, where the indigenous peoples have been the ones protecting it. They have been fighting against state interventions that destroy nature, you know, as well as corporate behavior that disregards nature. So we have to look at who are the proper you know, actors, who are the actors that should be given the authority to really speak on behalf of nature. Nature cannot speak by itself. Of course, it can by having all these disasters and all that. But some people have to really play a more active and dominant role in ensuring this kind of protection. Of course, the ideal is that the government should do it, but as we know, you know, the governments are not in that kind of setting where it's natural, you know, by their very nature to protect nature. So I think that's the question that still remains. If we respect the rights of nature, the rights of the rivers, and now there is something called the ocean kinship, no, where the
Yes.
oceans are kin, and we're going to work together in protecting the oceans. You know, all the it should be more inclusive in terms of the actions and the policies that are being taken to implement this, to protect and respect these rights.
And finally, Vicky, can I ask you about your own situation among your people, the Igorot people in the Philippines, Luzon Island? Are there issues now that Igorot people are concerned about and that might be helpful for you to say something to us?
Well, as you know, in the Philippines, there are the indigenous peoples are something like 15% of the national population. No, so we are found all over the country in many different islands. The worst situation now is, of course, the attacks and the criminalization of indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
No, as we talked about earlier, even I was included in a list of alleged terrorists last year. No, and I had to. There is a list of 600. Indigenous persons who are 600 people who are in that list, and you can be arrested at any time. So the UN was mobilized. Uh, I'm thankful to the UN to have mobilized themselves to protest against this, because as a rapporteur, I am supposed to enjoy immunity, and yet I'm included in that list. So that's the reality amongst us. No, we still have this, and just recently the Anti-Terrorist Act was passed, which is very vague in terms of who are terrorists. So it's an arbitrary way of selecting people that the state doesn't like, and arresting them, and in some cases even killing them. No, so that's the kind of situation that we face. But we are still strong. No, we are still asserting ourselves. We do have an Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in the Philippines, one of the few national laws that protect Indigenous people's rights. So we are pressuring the government to implement this law, as well as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I would say that here in the Cordillera, among my own people, we still live in a much better way, and we are, in fact, even in this COVID pandemic, my town has 0 cases, because we implemented our own traditional lockdowns that we have been doing since time immemorial, whenever there are epidemics, pests, and all that.
Vicky, this is so good to hear, especially the health of your community. And I have such happy memories of my visit to Mindanao with Taboli people in the 1980s, and your presence
Uh-huh.
at the Harvard conferences on religions and
Right.
ecology in 1997. And I'm so pleased to make this connection again and say thank you so much for this opportunity to hear your wisdom on the
Mm-hmm.
work of your career. You have given so much on behalf of Indigenous peoples,
Mm-hmm.
and we're very thankful and express our gratitude for this time today with you.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you for reaching out to me. I hope that our efforts to connect will really contribute in further raising awareness of the situations of indigenous peoples, as well as support, for the struggles that we are waging to have our rights respected and protected. So thank you very much for doing all this, and I do appreciate, the efforts that your consistent efforts, and Mary Evelyn's efforts in really talking about indigenous peoples' cosmologies and spirituality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicky.